forests of Chechnya, an old warrior stood before a Russian officer. He had lost an eye, he had lost an arm, he had lost a leg, but he had not lost his tongue, his courage, or his faith. When they told him to surrender, Baysangur of Benoy pointed toward the graves and replied, "Speak to them. They may listen to you before I do." Some men are remembered because they ruled. Others are remembered because they refused to kneel. Baysangur was one of those men. The 19th century Caucasus was not just a battlefield. It was a world of mountains, villages, forests, tribes, scholars, imams, and warriors fighting against the expansion of the Russian Empire. For decades, the people of Chechnya and Dagestan resisted under leaders such as Ghazi Muhammad, Hamzat Bek, and later Imam Shamil. Shamil became the most famous figure of the Caucasian resistance, leading Muslim mountaineers for around 25 years before his final surrender at Gunib in 1859. But beside these famous men, there were others whose names lived in the memory of the people. One of them was Baysangur of Benoy. Baysangur was born around 1794 in the village of Benoy in Chechnya. He came from the Benoy people, a community remembered for its fierce independence and its role in the resistance. Little is known with certainty about his early life, and that silence is important, because Baysangur does not enter history as a prince surrounded by palaces. He enters history as a mountain warrior, a man shaped by hardship, loyalty, and the struggle of his people. The resistance in the Caucasus was not only political, it was spiritual. The Murid movement combined discipline, sacrifice, and Islamic identity against imperial expansion. When Imam Shamil rose as leader, Baysangur became one of his trusted commanders, a naib, a deputy, responsible for leading men, defending territory, and keeping resistance alive. Accounts describe Baysangur as a commander of the Benoy fighters and an active participant in the Caucasian War. He was not remembered as a polished general. He was remembered as something harder, a man of stone. The legends around Baysangur are not soft. They are carved in wounds. By the mid-1840s, reports say he had lost an arm and an eye in fighting against Russian forces. Then, in battle around Gergabil in 1847, he lost a leg. According to tradition, he was captured after this terrible injury, but Shamil's men attacked the convoy and freed him, and because he could no longer sit normally in the saddle, they tied him to his horse so he could continue riding into battle. For most men, this would have been the end. For Baysangur, it became the beginning of his legend. There is a saying attributed to Baysangur that captures the heart of his legend. After years of war, wounds, captivity, and loss, his enemies believed they could still frighten him. But Baysangur is remembered as answering with the calm of a man who had already paid the price. "These wounds, I received them fighting you. What more can you take from me?" Whether the exact words were preserved by history or shaped by memory, the message is unmistakable. In 1859, the Caucasian War reached one of its darkest turning points. For years, Imam Shamil had held the mountains against the Russian Empire. But by then, the pressure had become overwhelming. Russian forces had taken Vedeno, his main stronghold, and pushed him deeper into the highlands. Shamil withdrew to Mount Gunib, a natural fortress of stone rising above the clouds, It was a place built for a final stand. Steep cliffs guarded its sides. Fog wrapped around its heights. Below, the Russian army gathered in force, tightening its advance around the mountain. After decades of resistance, Shamil surrendered at Gunib in 1859. For the Russian Empire, it was a victory. For many in the Caucasus, it felt like the end of an era. But for Baysangur, the fall of Gunib did not mean the end of the struggle. He was not a man who measured defeat by the surrender of a fortress. He measured it by whether the spirit of resistance was still alive. And as long as men were still willing to fight, Baysangur believed the story was not finished. After Shamil's surrender, Baysangur did not disappear. In 1860, he became one of the leaders of a new uprising in Chechnya. Accounts list him alongside other former leaders and naibs, including Umahaji Zumsoevsky and Atabi Ataev. In some accounts, Baysangur was recognized as Imam of Chechnya from 1859 to 1861. He was old. He was wounded. He was hunted. But still, men gathered around him. Not because he promised victory, but because he represented honor. One of the most unforgettable stories about Baysangur comes from this final period. Russian envoys, according to the account, approached him and demanded surrender. The meeting took place near a graveyard. Baysangur listened. Then he pointed to the graves. "Ask them," he said. "They may agree before I do." It was moments like this that made Baysangur so revered. Not speeches from a throne, not promises of victory, but the unshakable courage of a man who had already given everything and still refused to submit. In early 1861, Russian forces moved to crush the uprising. Villages were destroyed. People were displaced. Baysangur, now hunted, continued to evade the Russian army near Benoy with a small group of followers. Then came the final clash. According to accounts, his horse was killed beneath him near Benaduk, close to Benoy. Baysangur was captured along with his sons and companions. The man who had survived wounds, war, and captivity was finally taken. But even then, the story was not over. In March 1861, Baysangur was sentenced to death by hanging in Khasavyurt. By then, he had already lost almost everything a man could lose in war: his eye, his arm, his leg, his freedom, and many of those who had stood beside him. But even in captivity, the image that remained was not of a broken man. It was of an old warrior who had reached the end of his road without surrendering the one thing still left to him: his dignity. His sons were reportedly exiled. His body was buried in Ok near a crossroads. And his name remained, not because he defeated an empire, but because he showed that defeat and dishonor are not the same thing. And thus ends the story of Baysangur, a man who terrorized an empire, led a nation of mountain warriors who stood for truth, honor, and faith. They broke his body, but they never broke his will. Baysangur of Benoy, the man of stone.
For more great content, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe, and enable notifications. Wow Media, bringing you more than just buzz.